Hello, my name is Zubaidah Chowdhury, and today I have the distinct honor of interviewing human rights lawyer and professor Chaumtoli Huq. She's an exceptional attorney, social justice innovator, and associate law professor at the CUNY School of Law. Professor Huq is also the founder and editor of the progressive nonprofit publication Law at the Margins. Having been a staunch advocate for human rights throughout her life, she has served as a director of the first South Asian Workers' Rights Project at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. How are you doing today, Professor Huq?
Thank you. Thank you for such a generous introduction and kind introduction.
Of course, of course. And so I'd love to start off by just having you tell us a little bit about what motivated you to pursue human rights law.
Sure. So I was born in Bangladesh and I'm an immigrant to New York. I grew up in Bronx and I was raised by my mom, a single parent. And early on, I observed the hardships that she and other members of the larger sort of Bangladeshi, but South Asian and Asian community experienced as new immigrants. And these experiences, just observing them as a young person, I wanted to do something that would really change their lives for the better. And human rights specifically spoke to me because of the principles, right? The principles of human rights is this idea that every person has a right to live with dignity. They have a right to have their basic needs met, food, shelter, and I would add a job because my area is employment, to live in an environment that is sustainable and healthy, right? So for environmental justice, to be free from harassment as a woman of color, I think that's particularly important, and discrimination. And the idea is that there's this basic level of standards, we call this sort of the floor, beyond which we would not go. And it's given to you just by virtue of being a living being. So it's humans, but as well as all other species, right, that are in the environment. So this idea that it didn't matter where I was born, it didn't matter what my race was, it didn't matter what my gender was, but that I had a right to dignity. And I think that really spoke to me powerfully and profoundly. And so, although I didn't always know what that human rights meant or what it looked like as a young person, particularly as maybe as a high schooler, and then, I know you're in college now, even in college, I was just still learning, but really on a fundamental level, it really resonated with me. And I think that motivated me to learn more, to pursue studies, and to go on to obtain my law degree.
Absolutely. I completely agree with everything you said. And just for everyone's understanding, what exactly does a human rights lawyer do?
Yeah, I think I really appreciate this question because, the typical view of a human rights lawyer is someone who's working at the United Nations, someone who's working sort of in the international field, or working around a lot of these international agreements. That's all of that is true. There is a grouping of international lawyers, human rights lawyers that work in those spaces. But for me, given my experiences and what I've observed, as I mentioned earlier, for me, a human rights lawyer is one that stands shoulder to shoulder with those who are the most marginalized and helps to amplify their issues to a global audience, right? And so that might mean actually you never leave your neighborhood. You can be a human rights lawyer just by doing the work that you're doing in your neighborhood or your community, but it's just really kind of the spotlight is global. You're not focused only on sort of your narrow community. So for me, human rights work is really about all the things I mentioned, amplifying the rights of human beings and living beings to live with dignity. And you can do that everywhere. I mentioned that because I think when I was growing up, I thought there were, human rights lawyers were fancy. They traveled around the world, and they had a lot of money because you had to have a lot of money to be able to get on a plane and travel. And so I couldn't relate to that, actually, to be quite honest. Even in law school, I couldn't relate to that because I thought, well, I don't think that's something that I could be able to do. It didn't feel like within my grasp. But as I studied human rights work, I learned that actually all that international work is important work. I don't want to minimize that. However, there is another area of human rights work, which I call human rights from below, right? Human rights from the ground, from the folks who are most impacted. And so I tend to fall in that categories. Like, how can we actually use our legal degree, use my education to support those who are the most marginalized within our legal system?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And I know that definitely helped me better understand what a human rights lawyer does, because like you said, like when I think human rights lawyer, the first thing I think is like United Nations. So
Yeah.
glad that you brought up that point about from like the ground up,
Mhm.
and more of like almost like grassroots like type of work.
Yes. Yeah, I believe in the human rights work has to start from the grassroots. It has to start with the folks who are deeply impacted. And this relates to our conversation around the Rohingya issue, right? That we have to sort of look at how is this stateless or made to be stateless community is impacted. And so unless we really sort of listen to the issues that they're experiencing, we really can't go and then decide for this community, right? We have to listen and stand shoulder to shoulder. And so for me, that's really important. It's grassroots human rights. I think you characterized it perfectly.
Thank you. And so for the next question, I'd love to also hear more about your work with the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund.
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think given my experience as an immigrant, as a person of color, and also woman, I think one of the things that I realized is how economic justice is really important, and also racial justice and gender justice. Like they're all actually have to be looked at together. So when I graduated from law school after doing a clerkship, I got a Skadden Fellowship, which is a postgraduate fellowship, to start the first South Asian workers' rights project in the country. And the host of that project was the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, ALDEF. And I chose ALDEF because ALDEF had decades of work in the Asian American community. And they hadn't really done as much work in the newer South Asian community. And so I thought this would be a really great organization to sort of bring the project. And so I can actually reach out to essentially members of my own community. I worked with individuals who identified as their origin from Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Burma, right? And also people who were from the Caribbean, but of Indian origin. So it's a very broad sort of a notion of immigrants. And I basically represented individual like taxi drivers, domestic workers, people who worked in the fast food industry, what we call low-waged work. And I represented them and also sort of fought for their rights. That project continues, even though I left ALDEF, because it was a 2-year fellowship. But it was really the beginnings of paying attention to how our community had been affected. Now, as you know, the community is growing with the large Nepali, Tibetan community. And so the Asian American, South Asian community is like constantly growing, particularly in New York City. But that's what I started now. I mean, I can't believe it. It's almost 20 years ago.
Wow, that's incredible work. And honestly, like just thank you so much for what you've done for the Asian American community. And my next question is going to be like shifting to the Rohingya refugee crisis. So in 2018, you actually, I believe, organized a webinar for activists working on the Rohingya refugee crisis. So my question would be, can you tell us about some of the human rights issues currently affecting the Rohingya refugees?
Yeah, absolutely. So let me actually give you a little bit of background. My introduction to the Rohingya crisis, and I would say the Rohingya genocide. Genocide is the calculated and intentional effort by the state to essentially eliminate, an ethnicity of people. So we have to call it what it is, right? Which is a genocide. And so my introduction to this issue was way earlier. And so in 2010, a professor at Columbia had reached out to me, Gayatri Spivak, and she had invited me to accompany her as well as Tun King, who is a Rohingya activist, and he's the president of the, I believe, the Rohingya, Burmese Rohingya organization in the UK, as well as other activists to meet with the then chief of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Peoples, Elsa Stamat-Pulu. And in 2010, that's when I first learned about this issue, right? We're now going in 11 years, right? And of course, we know that the systemic discrimination against Rohingya in the Rakhine State has been going on for even longer in the 70s. But my introduction to this issue was actually way before the webinar. And so since then, I've tried to, in whatever little ways that I can, raise awareness on the issue. Since then, just like you asked for a little bit of the background, some of it was really kept. I think activists like Tunkin and others would go and try to lift up the issues of Rohingya in the UN forums, and really didn't get the sort of global and national attention, unfortunately, until 2017. And in 2017, what we witnessed was the horrific mass extermination and by the military of Rohingya that led to over 700,000 Rohingya. It was an exodus outside of Burma, and many of the Rohingya went to Bangladesh as refugees. There are also refugees in other parts, Indonesia and Malaysia, but Bangladesh is one of the countries that has kind of taken in the most of the Rohingya refugees. And so at that time in 2017, 3 years later, the UN sort of did a study, and they finally sort of, and I believe it was the first time where the United Nations sort of declared that there was genocidal intent in 2017 by the Burmese military, right? And so it then began to really elevate the issue that this is like a human rights issue that we need to really focus on. And in 2020, there was really a lot of testimony, and it came out, there was a New York Times article where 2 of the Burmese military confessed to execution, mass burials. And here I had wanted to talk to you about the gender dynamics of this genocide, which is mass rape, of Rohingya women that continue to this day also in the camps, even though it's not by the Burmese military. But when you create this crisis and overcrowding, who is the most vulnerable? It's going to be women. And so just to kind of bring us to the present, this is just really raises just a profound crisis, right? That we've not been able to do much on. Just in my own 10, 11 years that I've been working on this issue, it's just gotten worse, right? And so most currently, as you know, and just to step back, there's this crisis has been called ethnic cleansing, right? This sort of genocide. In 2021, Burma military, the same military that's been responsible for this genocide and killings and mass rape, has taken over power in Burma. And so a community that has already suffered so much is now, and there were conversations about repatriation, Now the worry is we're just sending people back to their deaths, right? And so that's going to be, so advocates have completely said no way. But within Bangladesh, it's created a sort of a secondary crisis, right? Which is initially Bangladesh was reluctant to take on Rohingya refugees, but through international pressure, finally they did, and you have the camps in Cox's Bazar in the southern part of Bangladesh. But more recently, now the government of Bangladesh is planning to essentially create this like almost like expel Rohingyas into the Bhasan Char, like an island. Again, so here's a community that's already been brutalized multiple times. And there's been an encampment that's been set up in sort of this Bhasan Char, this island as well. So from this initial crisis, because we've not held Burma accountable, right? That we're seeing this ripple effect, rather, right, of further issues, and we really need to stop and think about what we can do next. And this is why the essay context, even though it feels maybe perhaps for some small in the face of such catastrophe, I think we're going to need young people to step in and think about these issues creatively. I know you have that question, so I won't jump the gun, but I think adults have been looking at this for a long time, and we've just made it worse. And I think that this is an opportunity for young people to step in and say, particularly young Rohingya youth activists, right? There are youth activists that are essentially growing up in refugee camps and who are now sort of coming into leadership, and we need to sort of support them. But I can talk about that sort of, I think you have some questions related to that. But that's just kind of a little bit of the context. And there are a couple of fact sheets. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom has a really nice fact sheet that maybe you can sort of link into this interview to just really, so that folks who want to get informed about this issue, it's not too late to do that.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought up the point about how it's never too late to get informed. You hear that a lot, where it's like, oh, I'm not read into it well enough, or things like that. But I would love to just emphasize that point of it's never too late to just go ahead and take the time to read about it.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention two things actually in my sort of, how I came to this issue. One is, you may know that in 1971, when Bangladesh was fighting for its own independence from Pakistan, the Pakistani army used rape as a form of way to suppress the Bengali community, right? So we see how rape is being used. We saw that in this Bosnia-Serbian crisis. We see that how sexual assault is used by the military as a form of suppression. So given that history, I myself was an infant, so I have no memory, but I was born in 1971. So when I heard about the military using rape of Rohingya women, most majority Muslim women, again, I think it sort of surfaced within me a certain sense of we couldn't address this issue in 1971. We can't let this happen again. And then the other issue that I think oftentimes doesn't get discussed, because I'm an economic justice and economic rights person, why is the military so bent on removing and expelling Rohingya from the Rakhine state? The Rakhine state, the area, is rich with natural resources, oil, gas fields, and other kinds of maritime, waterway resources. So we also have to see this, and this is also true with the fight for Palestinian liberation, right? That underlying this is a political issue, but it's also a gender issue, as I mentioned, but it's also an economic resources issue. This is really fundamentally about a fight for resources, which indigenous communities around the globe have always fought back, right? Their land is being taken away, unfortunately, we even do that in Bangladesh, right? So we also have to connect all of those movements. That's what led me to do the webinar as part of an editor at Law at the Margins, because finally, the Law at the Margins wasn't created till much later. I had this opportunity to work with Burma Task Force, Adam Carroll, who I believe is also involved with Rights for Rohingya, to really amplify these connections, the solidarities, right? So that maybe you don't feel a direct connection to this issue, but maybe through other ways you might. Maybe as a feminist, you feel connected to the issue. As an economic rights, you feel connected to this issue. I mean, I hope you feel connected just because someone is being impacted. But I think what we wanted to do with that webinar is build solidarities across the globe. And also in Burma, right? Rohingya are not the only ethnic minorities, right? There's Karen and there are other minorities. So in our panel, which you're welcome to like share or hyperlink here, brought in other members of the indigenous and ethnic minorities within Burma, because it's really about building solidarity and against the military, because look, the military is like now taken over. So we just kind of have to understand what's going on in much more, sophisticated ways.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing up the points about economic justice as well. That is such an important dimension of this issue. And I know later on we'll discuss a little bit more about the gender dimensions of this issue. First, I wanted to ask if there's any legislation you believe could be enacted to ensure that Rohingya refugees' rights are protected.
Yeah, absolutely. So I believe in 2019, I think it was reintroduced. There was a Rohingya Genocide Determination Act in Congress. I don't believe that's been passed. So, I think part of the beginning to solve a problem is to name the problem. If we don't even acknowledge, for the longest time, Burma didn't even acknowledge Rohingya. They were denied citizenship. If I deny you as a person, your existence, then I can say, oh, you're not entitled to human rights. So the first step is this acknowledgement. So while the determination doesn't necessarily solve the crisis, but I think that's a really important first step. So we need to get that passed. And I think with now, hopefully a democratic president and supporters, I encourage folks to look at that. The other is we in the United States need to provide support to refugees, to Rohingya refugees. And so in terms of funding and in terms of even perhaps to some extent, Bangladesh is, as one of the poorest countries in the globe, has received 750,000 refugees. But comparatively, United States and the UK has not. And I think we can do better through refugee resettlement and supporting specifically the ability of Rohingyas to at least temporarily, so that they're not living in squalor camp conditions. Think about Ilhan Omar, who was a refugee, and she now is an elected official, right, in Congress, so that we should really support the sort of refugees, welcoming refugees. And then I think something that we should explore, although I give the caveat that any demands have to come through the Rohingya activists themselves, right? But given the state where it's a military state right now in Burma, that there has to be sanctions or some pressure on and repercussions on Burma, because of its actions. Even with Aung San Suu Kyi, right, as the Burmese, I mean, when I was in college, my mom gave me her memoir or autobiography to say, look, you want to do human rights work, and she's Asian. And I'm so disappointed, right, that she's not been able to really address and has ignored this issue. Nonetheless, we keep the focus on the military because that's really the main culprit. So sanctions, I think, is something we should explore, and other forms of economic leverage so that the military is held responsible. They should not be allowed to sort of essentially get away with their actions in 2017 and to the present. So those are some ideas, but back to the idea of like human rights from below. Any demands really have to come from the organizations that are working, that sort of Rohingya organizations that are working and listening to their demands and supporting what they have to say. But those are a couple of some ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up those ideas. And so now I want to talk about the gender issue aspect of this crisis, which is, like you said, such a giant part of this issue. So you focus a lot on gender, and you also mentioned you also just recently mentioned the weaponization of rape in this crisis. And so can you say more about this dimension of the Rohingya refugee crisis?
Yeah, what we've seen historically in any kind of, mass persecution where they're intending to, it's like ethnic cleansing. They want to essentially do away with peoples. Well, how do you do that? Right? You do that through, this weaponizing. I think your phrasing is absolutely right. Weaponizing sexual assault as a way to, essentially, sort of do away with people. I mean, in 1971, when the Pakistani army did that, it was to like essentially humiliate, but also to essentially create sort of like non-Bengali and like authentic sort of Muslims. So what we know is, as I mentioned, in 2017, mass rape was occurring. It's intended to silence, right, women. And it's a form of warfare, right? Like you're trying to really bring a community down. And then more recently, what we're seeing is reports of in Cox's Bazar camps in Bangladesh, high rates of sexual assault as well. And that's bound to happen because when you have masses of people in living conditions that are actually not habitable for human beings, and you have trauma, and you have, that's a moment where you're vulnerable and people can take advantage of that vulnerability. So sexual assault is very high in the camps. Trafficking, right, is again extremely high in the camp. So there's just multi layers of which women are impacted. Now, the other thing about, is women are also the caregivers of the next generation, right? So when you are, using, weaponizing sort of rape and sexual assault as a form of kind of ethnic cleansing, the goal of the oppressor in that instance is also to kind of suppress the next generation as well, right? Because trauma is intergenerational, right? And so can you imagine in just one lifetime, right, how that might impact family members? And I think it's intentional so that in the future, Rohingya youth are not able to really emerge and to thrive. And related to that is in the camps, there's really no education for the youth, right? So a lot of the activists who have kind of reached to Canada, US, and other parts have managed to go to school, but in those who are in the camps, find that they're not able to get access education. If we're thinking about the future generation, we need to, pay attention to young people. But I think that it's related to the sort of weaponizing of rape, right? It's like if you're kind of bringing down the mother who's often the caregiver, caretaker in families, that you're really trying to prevent the next generation from like being lifted up. So I think we need to pay attention to that, not just on the violence itself, but look at how trauma reverberates through the generation, right?
Yeah, I think that's such a good point about like how attacking mothers is just such a foundational way to like really cut them at their base and just really prohibit them from growing with like the future generation of the Rohingya refugees. And I really love that emphasis you put on the youth.
Yes.
And yeah, we'll definitely talk more about that. And so my last sort of like question on this part of the interview is, what role do you think global or international organizations can play in helping these refugees with the extensive human rights challenges they face?
So I'll give some ideas, but again, I want to always put the caveat that any demands have to come from those who are directly impacted. You know, as someone who is in strong solidarity and alliance with Rohingya, people and wanting, and just people who are made stateless, indigenous people around the world, I can show support. And so these are just some ideas, but ultimately, I think it's important that we hear from those who are directly impacted. So I think what I could do, and I've been trying to do, and it doesn't feel like enough. So I really appreciate this interview with you, because I think any opportunity for me to speak on this issue, I take it, right? So raising awareness, keep talking about it. Remember, I told you that I was first introduced to this issue in 2010. We're in 2021, right? And things have gotten progressively worse. And so I think we just have to keep it front and center in people's minds that there is this genocide that's happening, and we need to connect the Rohingya issue with other global struggles, right? So I think by connecting it to other struggles, we begin to see some commonalities, and we begin to see certain patterns, right? How certain communities are targeted and persecuted, and the how they are persecuted, and how the law actually sometimes is complicit, like plays a role in their persecution by silence, right? When you don't do anything, when the law doesn't address a situation, you're equally accountable. So that's raising awareness, talking about it, and then thinking about ways that we can leverage Burma, put pressure on Burma to address this challenge. They are ultimately culpable here, right? The military specifically. Now, let me say, there are many Burmese diasporic immigrants in the United States that are also non-Rohingya, right? Who do not support the military and are supporting the Rohingyas as well, right? So this is really about the state and the military. The other thing, I just learned you're an artist, right? And so a visual artist. And so one of the things that I did in my work around garment workers is I made a documentary around garment workers. And I interviewed workers talking about their conditions and what could they do and how we can support them. So, I think that sometimes talking like, no, it's like we sort of close our ears, but visual advocacy is powerful. Artists, documentarians. So I think one other thing that we can play, a role that we can play, is those who are artists. I did the film with a filmmaker, is we can actually use visual and other forms of artistry to like lift up human rights issues. And there's lots of history examples of that. So those are just a few. I think there are lots more ways that international organizations can play a role, and then also just provide monetary and other forms of in-kind support. As I mentioned, there are lots of young people who do not have access to quality education. There was a moment when some students were allowed to go to the area Chittagong schools, and the Bangladesh government sort of like halted that, and there was like pressure pushback on that. So I think just kind of figuring out any kind of also financial support, and just like lifting up the issues are some ideas that I can share.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. A lot of the things you were talking about seems like anyone could do, a high school student could do. So yeah, if you could please expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I mentioned earlier that we are now seeing a new group of Rohingya youth activists. So one of the panelists on the webinar from Law at the Margins was a youth activist based in Canada and working with Rohingya refugees in Canada. And so first, I think the essay contest, the Rise for Rohingya essay contest, is really important to do the awareness raising. You're going into high schools throughout the city, right? And students are having to research and write on this issue. And the minute they're writing on essay, they then become informed about the issue. And once you feel informed, unless you're just compassionate, you're gonna feel moved to do something about it. So I really think the essay contest is a really good start to bring in young people, to educate them and to learn about, kind of what the conditions are. And I mentioned earlier, I think that adults have been working on this issue for a long time, and to no success. So I think that the other part of this, the essay that I really like is you're asked to come up with solutions, right? Strategies, like what can be done. And we need sort of more, brilliant minds and thinking on this issue. The other things is, relief organizations, you can, in your school, actually do a fundraiser and then say you would contribute to a number of the relief organizations, Burma Task Force, which I'm mostly connected to. I'm sure Rise for Rohingya can direct students to charities that are reputable, because you want to make sure that they're going really to the people who need it. So that could be one. You can do some fundraising, awareness raising in your high school. You can do, kind of links with youth in the camps. When I was a young person, I did pen paling, right? And now, now you can actually potentially expedite that through technology. You can build relationship youth to youth. And so learn about what are the experiences that they have. Instead of funds, you can think about access to education is so key. So, and young people can, think about also raising supplies. I think, sometimes when I return back to Bangladesh, I bring school supplies for schools, in my suitcase, right? But if, I'm sure younger people are more clever and figuring out organizing. So there's just so many things you can do if you sort of have the will to do. But you can start with the essay contest, learn about the issues, fundraise for charities, raise awareness, connect with young youth activists who are also trying to work around these issues, and just really be involved. I think those are some kind of the ideas that I have, and I bet you all of yourself included and other finalists will come up with even more better ideas than I could come up with. But those are some that I would sort of think about.
That was a lot of ways. So now anyone who's watching this has no excuse to not.
I know, right? No excuse.
I think those were all my questions. So this was
Great.
such a wonderful time, and thank you so much. It was such an honor and a privilege to speak to you today.
Same here.